unless you are a panelist, if I can go ahead and ask you to mute yourself and turn off your camera, that would be extremely helpful for us. We're going to get started in about 3 minutes. All right, Ms. Mack, we are going to go ahead and get started. If you can kick us off, please.
Sure will. Good morning, welcome, and greetings to all New York Black Librarian Caucus members, panelists, and guests. I'm Phyllis Green Mack, a longtime member, past president, and retired New York Public Library librarian. Today, we will start with a brief history of the New York Black Librarian Caucus Scholarship Fund. The NYBLC has 2 scholarships. One scholarship for library school students pursuing a master's degree in library and information sciences, and a second scholarship, more recently added, for a library support staff member to pursue a bachelor's degree. That's a bachelor's degree in any subject. There have been scholarships awarded to 50 students since 1981. Totaling approximately $50,000. For many years, the fundraising committee held a jazz brunch to raise funds for the scholarship. These brunches were usually held in various Black-owned venues and quickly sold out. In 1980, the scholarship fund was established and named for Donna Hoke, a children's librarian at Queens Library who died at an early age. She was an active member of the caucus. The first NYBLC scholarships were awarded in 1981 to 2 recipients during my presidency at a reception held for the new chief, now it's called director, of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. November 2019, the NYBLC scholarship was renamed to honor the life of Tanyetta Gethers Muhammad, a branch manager librarian at Brooklyn Public Library. She was an active member of the caucus and the mother of 4 daughters. The new name of the NYBLC scholarship is Hoke and Gethers Muhammad Memorial Scholarship. The Andrew P. Jackson Scholarship for library support staff was first awarded in 2017 at the second scholarship ball. This second scholarship was the idea of the immediate past president, Sandra Michelle Echols, and Andrew P. Jackson, a past president of the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, to encourage library support staff to pursue a bachelor's degree. Each year, the NYBLC Scholarship Committee announces the scholarship and seeks candidates to apply. Please consult the website for more information. Now, I'll turn it over to Rebecca Rod, the moderator and planner of the 6-part virtual series, who will introduce the panel and give you more information. Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mack. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for telling about those scholarships. We will add a link where you can donate directly to those scholarships in the chat room, so be on the lookout for that. But to get us started, I want to just say hello. Thank you very much for being here, for being with us today. My name is Rebecca Rod. I am currently a library information supervisor with Brooklyn Public Library, and very soon I will be leaving to begin at Levine Greenberg Roston Literary Agency. But I am really excited to continue in this librarianship space. So thank you for being here with us. I would like to invite all of the attendees to go ahead. I would love for you to add your pronouns to your name. You'll see that some of the panelists have done that already. You can do so by clicking on participants, finding your name, and clicking on rename. I just want to also, before we start, let everybody know that tomorrow we have a membership meeting. It's from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. You can find more on our website. It's also, the Zoom information is already available on both our Instagram page and our Facebook page. And if you have any questions, you can email the NYBLC roundtable at gmail.com. Okay, and we can answer any questions, but you don't have to already be a member to join us. We would love for you to come discuss with us, learn what the caucus is doing, and decide if you want to be a part of it. But now we will go ahead and get started. All right. We've posted and shared a definition for cultural competency at the start of our session. Could we break this down? Panelists, please introduce yourself and, as simply as possible, share how you would explain cultural competency for someone hearing this for the first time. And just keep in mind that when we're having this discussion, we're coming from the scope of race. It is something that encompasses much more, but we'll be talking from a race perspective. But I'd like to go ahead and Dre, can you start us off, please?
I'd be very happy to. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today and also welcoming me into this space as well. So my name is Dre Jonathan. I'm a second-year Master of Science in Library and Information Science candidate at Pratt Institute, where I'll be chairing the Association for Information Science and Technology starting this year. My work interests include policy in and around data collection and its use, speculative fiction, poetry, and Black queer memory keeping. And I'm Nigerian and Ghanaian, as well as non-binary. My pronouns are they, them. And so these are the sort of experiential worlds that I'm drawing from when I think about what cultural competency is and what it means. So my offering for a definition is the process of learning to see and critically question understandings we gain within our own cultures and unlearning assumptions we have about individuals outside of ourselves and the cultures they are coming from, while affirming that, one, power dynamics are always at play in our interrelationships, i.e. some of us learn cultural competency as a survival tactic in spaces not designed or intended to welcome or care for us. And two, that this is a continuing learning journey and not a destination, i.e. we are always, or we should always be in the process of learning and unlearning.
Thank you, Dre, and thank you everyone for having me. My name is Shar Dre. I am an Afrofractalist, a Black scholar, and a multidisciplinary digital artist. I am currently pursuing my master's in data analytics and visualization at Pratt Institute, where I'm also the treasurer of ACES, and I'm currently working as a project coordinator at Brooklyn Public Library. So the way I would describe cultural competency is accountability and action. I feel like they go hand in hand. So knowing that words have power is important, right? And the etymology of these two words is really interesting, but I think that's a whole nother discussion that we can get into. But the original meaning of culture is the cultivation of the soil, right? And so in this instance, I'd say it's the cultivation of the mind. It's being authentic in your responsibility as a citizen of humanity, to be mindful, compassionate, as well as accountable for the actions, energy, and even the ignorance you may bring into a space. We could even say that it's cosmic citizens, right? We can call ourselves cosmic citizens so that we don't limit ourselves to just the terrestrial ecosystem, because as humans, we are expansive and capable of doing such incredible work. I think we should do better because we deserve better.
Greetings. My name is Andrew Jackson, also known as Sekou Malefi Bako, past president of the Black Caucus, director emeritus of Queens Library's Langston Hughes Community Library and Culture Center, and an adjunct instructor of Black Studies at York College and Library Science in the Graduate School of Library and Information Studies at Queens College, and also a member of the Board of Trustees at Queens Library. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel, and greeting of my colleagues and all the family of the New York Black Librarians Caucus. When I think of cultural competency, which is part of one of the discussions we have in our course that I teach at Queens College on libraries and a multicultural society, I was looking at the definitions that were shared with us by Rebecca, and it talks about having an awareness of one's own cultural identity and views about difference. I remember one of the quotes I always share with my students is that we need to celebrate difference until difference doesn't make a difference anymore. And we go into a lot of discussions about what that is and what that means. But it also reminds me of going back to some of the works of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., where he talks about in his essay, What is Your Life's Blueprint, going back to 1967. He says, number one in your life's blueprint should be a deep belief in your own dignity, your own worth, and your own somebodyness. And I think that, if, in layman's terms, really gives a real image for what somebody needs to look at in terms of themselves. And if you look at that in yourself, as Shar was saying, you have to share that with other people. It can't be just about who you are, but who everybody else is in their own personality, but also the connectedness that we have as human beings on this planet.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm extremely happy to be here. My name is Mark Gooden. I'm the Christian Johnson Endeavor Professor of Educational Leadership at Teachers College, Columbia University, in the Department of Organization and Leadership. So just building on what my distinguished colleagues have said, I'll just say my work also builds on this concept of cultural competence, but the way I approach it really comes from an area of culturally responsive school leadership. So in really defining that, I'll share a little bit about my research. I always start with culturally responsive school leadership with this approach to race. As Rebecca was saying earlier, obviously we expand that when we start to think about how we are competent. But I found race is the place where we need to start in America, given the history of the racial hierarchy and how it impacts so many other interlocking oppressions. You know, so you almost cannot separate it out. So one of the things I start with as well is identity. You may be familiar with a quote that says, we see and understand things not as they are, but as we are. So what I find is so many of my colleagues, my white colleagues and my white students, oftentimes honestly say they don't see, they know they're white, but beyond that, they don't go deep into race or anything about racial oppression, which implies that race is somebody else's business and that white is normal. So we have to start in this space about thinking about gaining and integrating new knowledge. And I think you have to really re-educate yourself in the histories of this country. And if I were thinking about this in a quadrant, which is the model I can describe, and that first quadrant is gaining and integrating new knowledge. And then from there, you really move into examining identity. And whatever identity means to you, I start with a racial autobiography. So you need to examine self. And then you move from there, you start to re-envision the world, which really means you start to examine how you come into the space, which you've heard from my colleagues, how do I show up? And then what impact do I have on others based on my identity? And then finally, you look at all three of those pieces to start to actually do your work. What are the actions you're going to take? And for me, that turns out to be anti-racist leadership. So that fourth quadrant is taking action based on all three of those other pieces that you've learned. So glad to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. I am so grateful and so excited to have you all here, part of this conversation. It could not be more perfect, so thank you. I just want to let all the panelists know, if you have come to the last two sessions, we're going to be doing this one a little bit differently. The structure for this will be that we're going to have some conversation. I'm going to try to limit the questions that I'm giving to allow the panelists to have the most dynamic conversation possible. While that's happening, if you could please add your questions, we're going to break the conversation in half and do some questions in the middle and then also at the end. So we're not waiting until the end to receive all of your questions. So please feel free to add them in the chat as they're talking. And we'll do it that way just to give everybody a heads up. It'll be a little bit different. All right, so we're gonna go ahead. I do have my first question for the panelists. Whether library is admitted or not, the preservation of whiteness is embedded in our library programs, in our scholarships, and in our initiatives. It allows white librarians to decide what amount of diversity is enough and is careful to make sure it's never too much. Although Black men and women have been dying at the hands of police for decades, the murder of George Floyd has seemed to finally be a tipping point for some white people. Now we see organizations and institutions, including libraries, pledging themselves to the Black Lives Matter movement through an express commitment towards diversity and anti-racist work. How, as April Hathcock has said, how is diversity a Band-Aid solution? And how can a focus on cultural competency rather than diversity get us closer to the anti-racist end goal we strive for? Panelists, whoever wants to start first.
I can go. So on both an institutional and individual level, I think white people have to realize throwing DEI training at white inferiority is not a solution, but a recipe for disaster, right? So diverse from what, equity from who, and included how. A lot of times we're asked to volunteer to sit in on DEI committees, but not welcome in the boardroom that's decided to put us there, right? So it's really important to recognize that. So cultural competency is a living metric where you can face yourself and your opportunities. It allows you to take ownership over your own ignorance, right? It's doing the work, not doing the want, not wanting to be or do better, but actually modeling it in your everyday life and your professional life. So it should really be embedded within the policy and procedure of the organization, along with significant follow through.
I agree with that. I think what we're talking about, diversity is just one chapter in a book and one subject in a course. It's not the entire course, and it should not be the total focus of an organization. It's one issue that they need to deal with. But when you're talking about diversity, you're also talking about equality. And if we have equality, then diversity is embedded into that framework of all of us being equal. Visibility, we're all part of the picture. And the second thing is we all have a voice at the table, but you have to be at the table. You have to be part of the committee. You have to be part of that structure in order to have that equality. And what seems to be missing, because the profession is a dominantly white woman profession, equity is something that we're always striving for, that we're always working toward. Diversity was something that was included in that with the discussions about the lack of equality in the profession. And we're always striving to make the library profession more equal, but the dominant framework of that profession are white women. So we have to make sure that we are eligible. That's why scholarships were made available to help people get their degrees so that they can become librarians, But once you become a librarian, you've got to be accepted as a true professional. You've got to be treated like a professional. You have to have a place at that table and have a voice, and your voice is not only heard, but listened to. It is a difference between hearing a voice and listening to the voice. And too often, our voices are never listened to so that some action comes out of that.
I think there's also something about, thank you to both of you for both of those incredible answers. I think there's also something in terms of us asking who is diversity for? Because there's a lot of ways in which the reason that diversity is such a band-aid is because it allows you to kind of say, well, we got our numbers up. And so we've done everything that we can, right? And so I think it's really important that we center that question, even as we suggest moving to something called cultural competency, right? Because there's also a way in which, if we're not careful, that too kind of becomes a kind of like, well, now we had all of our various trainings and now we are culturally competent. We have arrived at this place where now we understand difference. And so there is no more racism. And that's that we have to be very wary, I think, of what our goals are in and around diversity, in and around cultural competency, because if our goal, particularly if the goal is sort of kind of white institutional goal of alleviating guilt, feeling as if oh, I don't know how to deal with the fact that racism exists, and I just need it to be okay. I just need it to be okay. If we're not careful about what we are actually saying our goals are, which is a world that has not existed, right? A world where people fully are recognized, particularly Black people are fully recognized within the United States of America as full human beings in every aspect of that. Unless we're clear about that being the goal, even something that we're trying to frame as different from diversity, which is cultural competency, kind of just becomes the same thing.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll just add to a little bit of what my colleagues have said. You know, I think diversity is an organizational goal. We know that, and it's not necessarily benefited people of color. So I think that's how we flip the conversation on its head, right? For me, inclusion is a little bit beyond diversity in that you invite me into the organization, and then maybe you allow me to sit on, and I say allow, well, maybe you want me to sit on committees. You want me to show up and show that we're including you. But are you really including me where the power lies? Are you really including me into those deeper conversations? So diversity and inclusion, I mean, that's what we kind of start with, that benefits the organization. But equity for me is about power, and power is about outcomes. So if we're talking about you really bringing me on board and sharing equity, you need to be talking to me about the outcomes. Let's see what you look like, your representation, or like who's in charge. If it's five white women who are leading the organization, then you don't have equity. You got, if you just say, oh, well, we got diversity, but we got diversity in folks who are really working on the staff positions, or where's your diversity in leadership? And then we start talking about the second part of that is how conscious of it. We're all too familiar with getting that one person of color who just wants to be the one, but also doesn't do anything to change the outcomes or interrogate the system. So we have to remember to move this piece from the interpersonal, which is what I think cultural competence is. And really cultural competence, let's be clear, it oftentimes becomes about the comfort of our white colleagues at the expense of Black benefit. So, I've done workshops before, and my white colleagues are happy if it's just maybe I learned something. And then they ask me, what else can I do? You can go read. You can go do some research. It's a content area that you need to learn about. If you were learning about any other things in the library professionally, you would do research on it. So it's amazing how people shifts it back on us. And diversity and inclusion always end up being the benefit for them, whereas equity becomes our burden. Like, oh no, you're asking about outcomes. We can't give you the power, but we can certainly benefit about you, with one or two of you being here. And so we have to really reframe that and ask, what are the outcomes and how are they benefiting people of color, specifically Black folks?
I'm glad you added that, Mark, because I was thinking, I was writing notes, and that was the same note I wrote down about power. But it also, when you talk about power, you also talk about shaking up the concept of privilege as well, the privilege that all of our white colleagues automatically have, but they don't even see the lack of privilege that we have because we're still getting in the door, we're trying to open the door, we're trying to knock down the door.
Right.
When we get inside, being accepted that we are equal part of that discussion. So yeah, power and privilege definitely have to be part of that discussion.
That's right.
I think also just to add to the idea of competency, right, and what we are trying to become competent in, I think it's really important that part of our work becomes turning, instead of having it be only you're gaining an understanding of those outside of you, that has to be paired with gaining an understanding of yourself, right? Which I think, like we've all said in different words already. But I think that is particularly helpful in terms of shifting the conversation, right? Because again, it's not about just getting the numbers up. It's not even enough, as you were just saying, Mark, to just have us at the table, right? Like, so how do we move to these steps beyond that? And part of that, I think, has to be, particularly for our white colleagues, turning the mirror on yourself, like really understanding where are you coming from in and around race, or not coming from, or where you think you're not coming from, before you can even get to the point of, okay, and now I can attempt to gain an understanding of you. Especially because, as something that I pointed out at the beginning, for some of us, particularly for Black people, especially when you're working in these institutions where for many different kind of identity positions that you exist within, right? You may be the only, you have to become very competent at, it's not exactly the same thing as cultural competence we're talking about, but you have to gain a specific understanding of what's being said in between the lines to protect yourself, because you know that these institutions are not doing the work, do not have the infrastructure to protect you.
That's right.
So that's something that comes up for me again when we think about power, right? Like, who is always having to already be competent, and who doesn't even have to recognize that there is a lack of competency in the room.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
I want to just go ahead and jump in really quickly. Something that Dre said actually stood out to me. One of the elements that is required to become culturally competent is the idea of having the capacity for self-awareness, right? And so, like Dre said, you have to turn that mirror on yourself. You need to look at yourself. And so, and I know that, I don't know who it was, I'm sorry, but someone in the chat brought up the idea of tokenism, and we're kind of having that discussion here as well. And so we've already talked about how librarians code switch in previous conversations, but for this specific conversation, how do we ensure that to avoid them, right? To avoid the burden of the growth of white people becoming more competent doesn't fall directly on Black people's shoulders, on Black librarians' shoulders. How do we ensure that all librarians feel an equal responsibility to be cultural competent to patrons of color, to their colleagues of color? How do we inspire a feeling of equal responsibility? Is that possible?
Anything is possible. When I think of how do we make change in all of this, in my eyes, after all of that I've learned over my 36 years in the profession, and transitioning to becoming a library educator and Black Studies educator, it all goes back to education. And I believe that if we started, I have this discussion with my Black Studies students in the first 2 weeks of the class when I'm talking about the history of ancient Africa. And my students constantly ask me, well, why didn't we learn this in high school? When I'm thinking of all of these issues that we talk about with cultural competency and being aware of self, if we go back to how we're educated in the colonized educational system that begins with Europe and doesn't begin with Africa, our whole educational process has been flawed. So if you start on the beginning, think about it. In a child care center, in an elementary school, kids don't care what culture you are, what color you are, what your hair looks like, what your facial images. They just want to know, do you want to play? We're going to have a good time. But all of a sudden, somewhere in the early middle school ages, things start to separate, and we start seeing things in terms of color and race. We need to go back and correct the educational system and have a multicultural educational syllabus where we learn about the world as it is, multicultural, multifaceted, multi-image, and the history of all of our people. And I think if we start that way, by the time our students get to college, they have a different respect for all of the cultures that they live with and they see, and they don't have this image of what America has done to us with this colonized educational system. I think it goes to education. If we deal with our library institutions and colleges and universities, if you don't have a libraries as a multicultural in a multicultural society type of curriculum, that's a mandated course for us to take so that it talks about cultural competencies, it talks about multicultural, it talks about diversity and all those things and collections and libraries and the staff that you have. That shouldn't be a surprise when you get out into the profession, but it's still an elective in the curriculum, in many curriculum, and not even all curriculum at all library schools. But too many of our students, they graduate, they get out in the field, and their interaction with what they call minority communities, minority staff, is a secondary thought instead of part of the primary thoughts of part of our education and how we're grounded in what this multicultural situation is for America and our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I can just pick up on that, I think, let's be clear. America has a race problem. It's not our problem as Black people, right? But they try to shift the burden on us. America has a race problem, and I just to give you some evidence of that, I'm in the area of organization and leadership, and I train folks who want to be principals and superintendents and policy once in education. But I've been called in to do consulting in higher education institutions, community colleges, nonprofits, and all of them come up with the same thing. We didn't get this when we got our MBA. We didn't get this when we got, and so America has a race problem. And some of the same stuff I'm talking about, people are like, oh, that's so, wow. But the problem really continues with the status quo, right? Because it's uninterrogated. So it becomes normal and it's embedded within all these systems. So you can walk into anything, almost anything that we do, anything really you do in America. And it's like Derek Bell said, racism permeates all aspects of American life. But why are so many of our white colleagues still surprised that what they're doing is really hurting us? And speaking of going in and talking to organizations, I think money is a great motivator and a great way to inspire me to come in and do some work with you. Because now white folks are now doing anti-racist work and getting paid, right? But when we start talking about it, even that same lens, it's like, oh, well, you charging money to do this? So many Black folks who do this work are expected to do it for free. Whereas white people, they're just like, oh, you are an expert. And this is what I've seen firsthand. And this is what my colleagues my white students have told me this. But they tried to bring me in and they had to fight to bring me in. Whereas a white person, they brought in for 2-3 times the same money. Not even a question. Is that enough? Are we paying them enough? That was a white person, not me, right? So I think we have to be very clear about when those things come up. And the other thing is just very simply at the organizational level. How do you motivate and inspire your employees? We know money again. If you're spending money to train people to go to these conferences, and if you're spending money to say, we want you to be aware, then folks will get it. But if you just say, we're gonna do this one shot, one stop, 1 hour thing, they're gonna be like, that ain't nothing. We're gonna go in and spend that hour and then we're gonna be done with that, right? A friend of mine who's a consultant said he showed up one year to do diversity and equity training. And then he said he went to go back the next year. And the lady was like, oh no, we did that last year. We're done with that. Say, no, you're not. But that's the kind of mindset that we build within our organizations, which makes it very hard for us, again, to come in with that, because we look like we have 3 heads. Because that ain't in our objectives. We don't know anything about that. Oh, wait, put in diversity, but don't do anything with it.
Right. And this is another point. I think white people need to own their whiteness and take responsibility for the intentional ways that they have actually tried to avoid it, right? Like intentional ways they avoid opportunities to listen and learn from people who have lived experience, right? Before, they're called a bigot, not afterwards, right? So decentering whiteness without disruption. This is the main reason why I don't like I have an issue with DEI training. It's because of the cultural taxation it puts on Black and brown people. It's a huge burden, right? And it's a disruption not only to our workflow, right, but to our quality of life. We have to train alongside people who are learning about racism when we've experienced it firsthand. How traumatic is that, right? You know, reading is a great tool, but how you apply it is what counts, right? Intention versus impact. So I've encountered plenty of well-read racists in academia, you know, who go on to be well-read, well-intentioned racists in organizations. So realizing there's no quick fix to this, you know, and there's no throwing one training or a book at the issue, right? It's a continuation.
Good point. Good point.
Yep. That's right.
I know that we're generally kind of looking within race more particularly, but some readings that I've been doing recently that I think might be interesting within this context in and around gender and masculinity and manhood have been talking about the ways in which the way we talk about patriarchy, we talk about it as if it's something that only affects femme people. And we have to move into a position where we understand that we should be talking about patriarchy regardless of our gender identity, because we're all being hurt by it in some way.
Yes.
And so to bring that into this context, what I'm not saying is white people need to learn about racism because it's hurting them in the same way that it's hurting Black people, because it's not. But we do need to move out of this idea that I think has also already been said by my fellow panelists, that somehow race is a thing that is like a Black issue. And so we have to wait until, I just saw someone in the chat talking about how it's something that's not talked about within LIS programs because you don't have a lot of BIPOC faculty. But why does it take I mean, we should have more BIPOC faculty, but why is the fact that we're not present, why does that mean that the conversation isn't happening? So I'm not sure what form that needs to take, but somehow there needs to be an understanding that this is not just something that is important or should be important because you're Black. It's already going to be important because you're Black, and it's not even important. It's not even important for great reasons. It's important to you because you're Black, because you know you're going to be experiencing racism, and you're currently experiencing racism.
And if I could just off of what Dre said, was that is so important. And you know, Ruha Benjamin stated, "Who gets to define the problem that technology is able to fix?" And in this situation, you know, it's recognizing that there are people who intentionally made the decision to exclude courses on diversity, you know, and Black studies and multiculturalism, right? You know, acknowledging that that might be a place to start and deconstruct, like, who are the people within these institutions that are maintaining rather than challenging this mentality, right? It's intentional. It's not just that it just happened, right? So building.
And if I can add, Sharp, and I would say those are the same people who decided to exclude BIPOC people in the first place, right? So to Dre's point, it's so amazing that white people show up in a white space and they say, "Oh, okay, race is not even in the room." Like, yeah, why is it just y'all? And then it's like, we got to bring race in, which again shifts the burden to us. The question you should be asking yourself is, why is it so white up in here, right? But they don't see it because whiteness is normality for them.
I wanted to just add to that point. I have here representation matters, where people of color do not see reflections of themselves, they do not see opportunity, and they do not sense safety. And just how do we get organizations to understand that cultural competency, diversity, including more Black people in their organizations actually benefits them, right? Like if they're not motivated just by sheer altruism, like how do we encourage them that it's actually beneficial for them?
I think part of that goes back to that discussion that Mark and I were mentioning about power. As long as they are the numbers, they see power. And they see one person, they don't see any power in our community. The other thing I was thinking about, what Mark was talking about, what Shar was talking about, Andre, is that when we are in the room, you're looking at this panel right now, we are only 4 examples of the diversity within the Black community. So with them having a person in the room who may have all the credentials that they're looking for, and maybe, you know, one of the prominent hard workers and a director or whatever their criteria would be, they're coming from the single perspective of being that one Black person. But whether they come from the South, whether they come from the North, whether they come from New York Public or Queens Public, whether they come from the Caribbean, whether they come from Central South America, the multifaceted personalities and lifestyles we have within the Black community. You can't have one person on that committee and say that I represent Black America. No, I do not. I represent Andrew Preston Jackson Sekou Malefi Bako. I'm from Queens Library. I'm from Queens Library. But don't put me in there and say I represent all Black people. And that tends to be what happens when they put us on committees as well. We're speaking for the whole race. No, 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 no. Are you speaking for the whole race? Then neither am I. And that becomes an issue as well. Unheard of issue, don't discuss issue, but it definitely is an issue.
Absolutely.
All right, so I'm going to just take a pause right here. We had a question in the chat room that I just want to give to the panelists. Roxana said, is it only the white librarian that needs to be or become cultural competent?
No, everybody, because they're within the Black community. There are people in our Black community and other communities. The other part of that is when we're talking about this today, we're talking about it coming from a Black perspective because we are a part of the Black community. But the same discussion could be held for all the other cultures that are still waiting in the door to be let in the door and be given the power that we're looking to push into that doorway as well. So we're not just speaking about us, it relates to all cultures, but no, that's not the case. Everybody needs to be made aware of this, and it needs to be a discussion holistically and not just pushing it toward white people. It's not just about white people, it's about all of us.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, the complexity around what Dre was referring to earlier when we start to think about this idea that many of us not even ready to grapple with intersectionality, right? Or how we struggle with particular aspects of identity in the Black community that's intertwined with race, right? And this is built into our civil rights movement. This is built into our thinking. I used to love when Barbara Sizemore would talk about women being in the civil rights movement and wanting to be up front, but told like, we need to have men up front. And so she pushed against that, but it was this idea like, well, wait a minute, how are we reproducing some of those same hierarchical ideas that come out of that racial hierarchy, right? Same thing about what was told to Bayard Rustin, right? One of the major organizers, kind of like, well, about your sexuality, but we cannot have that. But remember, that was really pushed upon us by white supremacy that had this particular aspect and construction of Blackness as you need to be in a suit, you need to be hyper masculine, you need to be the man first. All these ideas, we don't get to interrogate that ourselves if we don't get into this space and start doing our own learning. And then the other thing we don't talk about, I got a sister here, Dr. Bouquet, I'm gonna throw a shout out, the health around this, how we really deal with this and what we take on as a cognitive load. I mean, I remember doing a training, a sister that was working as a secretary in an organization with all white people. She just came up to me and just said, I just wanna thank you, because before you started saying this stuff, I was almost on the verge of feeling like I'm going crazy. Because I kept asking myself, is it me? Am I something wrong with my people? All these things we don't get a chance to process, but we carry it around here, and it ends up killing us eventually. So we absolutely got to be educating ourselves about this work and understanding how to defend ourselves. You got to defend yourself in these spaces. These are vicious spaces.
I'd also just love to add that, we live in a world, I'm not speaking in a larger context now, a world that is very violent along many different axes of power, and we are all steeped in that world. And so to varying degrees, we all have these things within us that we need to unlearn. In this particular context, in this talk, because of the ways in which the institutions we're talking about, libraries, are steeped in whiteness, we're doing a lot of and because we're speaking within the American context, we're talking a lot about, rightfully so, the ways in which whiteness has a lot of work to do. But I think it's important that when we're thinking about cultural competency, that like earlier when we're talking about the mirror, it's important that we are putting the mirror up to ourselves too, because we have taken in a lot of violence. We are doing a lot of violence on ourselves.
Right.
And we won't be able to move into this new equitable structure until we kill that thing in ourselves. We'll be carrying it forward. So definitely, this is work that's important for all of us.
Right, right. And acknowledging, just to going off of that, our adherence to, these respectability politics, right? That so often, that prevent us, right, from holding ourselves accountable. And also, a lot of times with that fallacy of professionalism, our white colleagues, right? So it's really important to also, when you say point the mirror back at us, sometimes that you see like gatekeepers, right? And totally embodying that like scarcity mentality, right? That there's not enough for all of us, right? And the ways in which we hold each other back from progress. So it's important to acknowledge.
I think the other addition to that would be, if we're going to have this discussion about cultural competencies with the white community within our profession, we need to have that same discussion within the Black community. We need to have the same within each of the different cultures, has to have that discussion within their own community. So when they come to the table, they're clear about what the agenda is going to be that they bring to that table, and how we're going to address it, and what our outcomes need to be for that solution.
I just want to share another question from the chat. Lori asked, how does urbanity or rurality impact the teaching and reception of cultural competence, especially in library settings?
Well, as a instructor at Queens College Graduate School, it first begins with respect for everybody in the classroom, respect for everybody in the profession. If you don't respect yourself, you can't respect other people. So you have to have self-respect first. But then we need to just have that agenda item as part of our action mode, that we are going to respect the opinions, we're going to respect the differences, and we're going to respect the fact that we're all part of this together. If something affects me, it affects you. I remind my students in my Black Studies class, we can't be free as Black people in America until white people are free. They're not free either. So they're so busy looking over their shoulder at us, they can't be free, just like they were on the plantation. We need to have the discussion, but you have to have that respect for each other. And that it starts with respect, but then it goes into other areas as well. But it starts with respect.
I see one more question here, and then we'll continue with the second half of the conversation, but we'll also open again for questions. But this question is from Melanie. She asks, should or can BIPOC take training alongside whites, or should the training be separate?
I'll jump out on that one. I think both can exist, but you have to set up some parameters, and I've gotten better at this over the years. I do quite a bit of workshops with cross-racial workshops, and for a lot of people of color, it is definitely therapeutic, and they need to share, they want to get it out. But as Char was referred to earlier, I've learned to be careful so that Black folks are not starting to just be the ones educating white people in the room, because white people get real quiet, right? And so you got to figure out ways to pull them into those spaces. And I also think that there's some benefit to having an affinity space. I think you have to be careful about how you construct those around people of color and white folks. And I'm not one of those people who think you mean saying Black folks are not a monolith. People of color got different kinds of issues that have been projected on us on white supremacy. So we can't all be an affinity group. So I don't know how to do that. I should say I don't know how to do that, because it can be messy. Because but Black folks can be in their space and sharing some of this and connecting is good. And then white folks just need to go off. And then if I'm in a group of white people, like I tell them, like I was doing the keynote Monday, and I just said, look, y'all, when I was a mathematics teacher, I had to go get my resources and get stuff from the National Council of Teachers Mathematics. You're a teacher in a space where anti-racist leadership is everywhere. You got to go do some reading and some homework and some professional development. Almost every professional organization now is trying to say something. So you can't be like, where do I find it? I ain't going to believe you. And I'm going to think you're being a little disingenuous, just to be frank. So you got to be real about this thing. So I think that we just have to be careful when we're in those spaces together, and make sure that you have set of agreements, and Black folks are not doing all the work to educate people, even if it's therapeutic for them. You know, I have to say, hey, relax. Because, you know, because like I said, I've seen it happen too many times. They just sit back and be like, go tell us, feed us. And it can't be like that. They gotta be uncomfortable, in other words, because that's where the learning edge happens.
And just like a curriculum for a semester, it's not just about the conversation. Too often we have a workshop, you have a consultant like Mark come in, he does his workshop, you got all these fevers, you got a great lunch, you get a good paycheck, and then the next day it's put in a file and nobody ever does anything from that workshop or from that discussion. The discussion opens the door, but in order for something to happen, there's got to be some action items, that outcomes that Mark talked about, that come as a result of that conversation. Where do we go from here? And the other part, it can't be a workshop you only have once or once a year and say, we had the workshop, we do this every year, but nothing comes out of it other than that workshop that you do every year. Got to be some action items built into the agenda for what the interpretation and what the purpose is of this whole discussion.
Amen.
I definitely, because I mean, as a Black person, and I love my people, and so I always just want us to be aware of what labor we are taking on and what things are we carrying. And so I will never tell, I would just from my own experience, can't tell anyone else what is most therapeutic or what will work best for you. But I just always want to put out there, be thoughtful about the energy that is leaving your body and coming into your body. And it is okay to not want to be in spaces that are not serving you. It is more than okay to do that. And just please think about the labor that you put on yourself, because as we've talked about this whole talk, it is very easy, you know, because you are only the master of your own experience. As a very good friend of mine named Melanie once said, right? And because you know your experience, it's very easy for you to be in a conversation with somebody who does not know your experience and immediately set up this hierarchy of student and teacher unintentionally. And so please just be wary of your energy, be wary of the labor that ends up being put on you. And it can happen so quickly. And it's unfair. It's not fair to you, and you have every right to manage your energy flow.
Yeah, I would also just like to say, Black women, you know, it's okay to say no, opt out, okay? Because that another talking about self-preservation, a lot of that work always falls on us. So, and I know this from being in different institutions, and you know, and so it's not so much that we're not trying to stand up, right? Some of us might be like, oh, I'm so quiet, I wish I could. No, I get it, you're tired. So let somebody else come in and help you out with that, right? But also for everyone just to know, like, it's not just solely our responsibility, you know? Protect Black women, right? Black femmes, right? So that's where I just wanted to make sure that point was heard. Thank you, Dre.
Yeah. And I think one other thing I would add is that this concept, the creation of a New York Black Librarians Caucus and all the other ethnic caucuses of the American Library Association is a reaction to what the American Library Association was not doing as an organization that was supposed to represent all of us and all of our communities and all our collections. So the purpose and the mission of organizations like New York Black Librarians Caucus, American Indian Library Association, the Asia Pacific Library Association, Chinese American Library Association, and Reforma is for all of the different cultures to have a voice, be at the table, and make differences within our profession on a large scale, not just within ALA, but what libraries do around the country. So the action organizations that we have also have a role. So a lot of this homework has to be done within our organizations. So when we go to ALA, we have our agendas clear and we work together. Black Caucus does their thing independently, so do all the other caucuses, but they also have a joint Congress of libraries librarians of color that come together as a multifaceted, multicultural organization to address issues that we all face together while we do things separately in our own camps. So the organizational structure within librarianship is an action organization, and it requires activism on all of our parts.
Thank you so much. I want to go ahead and ask a question. Dre brought something up that I wanted to touch on a little bit off course, but in a city as diverse as New York City, 99% of students arrested for crisis situations are students of color, while across the nation, on average, Black students specifically experience a suspension and expulsion rate 3 times that of their white counterparts. The disproportion of police involvement in regards to patrons of color also exists in libraries. How could implementing a trauma-informed approach to library services help to improve the safety of our patrons? And then also, how did this just also translate to the workplace?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think the first thing to understand is that we are not our traumas, right? When implementing trauma-informed approach. So it's not about pity, it's holding space for people to heal, right? It's contemporary compassion, not punitive approaches. The fact is that Black and brown children lose their innocence at such a young age due to systemic racism, and we're dying out here because of it. There was a study that utilized eye tracking technology in preschool, where the teachers they're asked to analyze the room for antisocial behavior, right? And of course, that authoritative gaze was always trained on who? The Black boys in the room, right? So, Angela Davis stated that this, until the color of your skin is a target, you will never understand. And I second that, right? When you are working with people who may not conform to what you believe is a social norm, think about why that is before you act on impulse, right? Think about what makes you the arbiter of justice.
I think just thinking about trauma within educational spaces and library spaces, something that part of what brought me into librarianship is Black librarians who saved my life at multiple times when I was younger. And so I come into librarianship thinking about it first and foremost as care work. You use this word healing, and I don't know to what degree that is always centered within our curricula, within our institutional spaces, but what would it look like for us to think about if we thought about librarianship more and more, as some of us have always done, or as maybe we once did, as care work, what would that mean for thinking about trauma within these spaces? I think it becomes then almost immediate that if you are a care worker, the last thing that you want to do is continue to or reify trauma in the people that you are supposed to be caring for. And that's regardless of where they're coming from. So that, I don't know if that necessarily gets at an answer to your question, Rebecca, but that for me is a way of us trying to figure out how do we place trauma and what it does to people and what it does to Black people, and particularly within the library space. We're supposed to be care workers. So we're the last people who should be reifying trauma.
We're not trained trauma.
Colleagues. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. This idea about disproportionality, and when I saw that question, Rebecca, I was like, oh, she's coming right down my street, because I remember I work with school leaders and assistant principals who oftentimes are put in charge of discipline, are the ones who are seeing these mid-suspensions come across their desk. And so the question becomes, did you not see a pattern? Did that not jump out at you? And so it goes back to what your assumptions are, right? Your assumptions are these are the bad people, and this is what they do. And so it's not us. And so I always, going back to flipping that again on the identity of the persons who are causing the trauma, they got to go into a space and interrogate that and not be mad that somebody, like you calling me a racist. And no, you're doing some stuff that's causing some kind of outcomes. So I think that when we should absolutely deal with the healing, but from that organizational standpoint, this is where we start talking about things like equity audits and culture audits, and we start looking at data. And this is what I like about what's happening in the country right now. People showing up, and all these higher education institutions, for instance. Someone say, "Oh yeah, look, Black Lives Matter. That's us." And people are like, "Wait a minute, you got like a 2.5% Black faculty. Did you just start this, right? And your Black students are not being recruited or retained very well." That's an outcomes question. And so let's monitor that from year to year, and then we can see if what we're doing is having any kind of impact. And if it's not changing, I'm just going to tell you, like I said, we don't believe you. It's disingenuous. It's inconsistent, right? So your theory of action is not playing out very well. You got this espoused theory, but it ain't showing up in the data. So we have to really, I think, hold people's feet to the fire. And that was a great time to start doing that.
I think also when you talk about the education of librarians for our future, basically our graduate school curriculum is designed to manage collections, books, and technology, but it's not really teaching you about the people. So that's why that libraries is a multicultural course needs to be in there, but also you need to expand the curriculum so that you bring in the specialists from social work and from health services to help us understand how this fits in, because all of those people with all of those parameters of life come into our libraries. So if we're going to be having issues with children and students and all these things, then we need to have those specialists as part of our training as librarians. You get the master's degree in library science and you go and get your PhD, but if we haven't gotten some of these skills and talents built into our curriculum, then we're still being miseducated and we're coming in unprepared to go out into our communities and serve it to the best of our ability.
Thank you. I want to ask the panelists one more question, and then we can go ahead and open it up to some final questions from the chat room before we close. Okay. In a study performed by the IZA Institute of Labor Economics, it concludes that Black students are more likely to graduate from high school and attend college if they've had Black teachers. Being Black does not necessarily make for a better educator or a librarian, but can make for a more relatable one. It allows Black individuals to be seen for their charms and challenges without the filters of minority or urban or at risk. This is crucial considering that children of color now account for the majority of the nation's 74 million children. How can white librarians display cultural competence without making one of the following common mistakes: of lowering achievement expectations based on race or ethnicity, participating in cultural appropriation as an effort to create connections, and or perpetuating a white savior complex?
That's a hard one. I try to tell my students who come from different cultures that you have responsibility to serve the entire community. And when you talk to young people in your community, it needs to be with an open mind, with direction of service to the community and not isolating those poor kids and my good white kids that are great. But that's difficult to do based on the training we get. Again, part of the disruption in the profession that I find, and I mention it to the faculty and the administrators at Queens College, is that we need to upgrade the curriculum, and we need to have more people-centered courses that deal with the people in the profession and not just the collections in the profession and how we have the right books, or we upgrade the digitalization, or we got the right technology. It's all about the people, and we need to do more focused training on what the people that are in our profession bring to the profession, or what the skills we need to service the community, particularly here in the 21st century. One of my frustrations as an old, I call myself an OG because I'm 73 years old now, and I've lived through and worked through the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, looking at Black Lives Matter. I teach Black studies, is that we are not really ready to deal with this issue. We shouldn't even have these discussions in the 21st century. We should be past all of this by now. But the fact that we bring the same issues into the 21st century, and we're closing in on the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, that W.B. Du Bois talked about in the beginning of the 20th century, we really made no progress. So until we start looking at things objectively and changing the curriculum, how we teach our children, how we raise our children, how we conduct ourselves in the children, we're still talking about the two different dreams, the American dream and the American nightmare.
I'd like to comment on that if I can. And thank you, Professor Jackson. You know, I had a pleasure speaking with some educators all this week, and mostly white educators, I should say that. And I think that you pointed to some components that come out of white culture that are, you know, ways of relating to people of color that are okay. And I think that the way white people have to do their work, the way they start their work is what I was saying earlier. You got to start with a racial reflection. And, you know, if you want to have some fun over the weekend, call your white allies and get them like 3 or 4 questions on just how race has appeared in your life over the last, and just talk and revisit and see how that is. Now you probably have some woke friends, but call the ones that are not woke for you know, added excitement. And I'm saying it in jest, but really what we find when a lot of our white colleagues do racial reflections, if they're honest, they say, well, I know I was white, but I had never thought about it. This was really uncomfortable. You know, I had to kind of go, and that's where they need to be, and they need to go deeper, because if they haven't had a reflection on race, they show up trying to save Black folks. They show up trying to fix Black people, right? And they show up trying to do all these things. And I struggle with this on some days, many days, but I'm one of those people who really, I believe that people are inherently good. They're impacted by their experiences, but I do believe people are inherently good, but can be selfish, right? We got this thing where folks don't want to give up certain things. So one of the things I think that stuck with a lot of those white educators was a term, this phrase I came up with, and it was abandon this idea of being good and embrace the idea of doing good. You need to stop walking around thinking about, I don't want people to call me bad or racist because no. Abandon the idea of being good and do something by embracing the idea of doing good. And if you want to talk to me about doing good, let's start with the racial reflection. Let's start with some discomfort. Let's start with some action steps you're going to take to be a real ally versus one that's comfortable for you. And that's how we start to move the conversation forward. And I've done that with my leaders. I've written on that. And that's the thing they come back and say, I started reframing everything from resources to teacher hiring to interacting with family around that question of, well, from that racial autobiography, because I had to see race. And when all my white friends, other white colleagues, when they were in there, other white people would say, we don't really talk about that until you're sure, or we talk about it in a way that we can't share with you, right? But when we get to that point, now we can start integrating in their work.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. I suppose my answer to this question, particularly because it's geared specifically at white librarians and white educators, is just understand that Black people are people, and we're not just symbols of the things that make you feel guilty or a problem to be fixed. You, especially if you as a white person are just beginning to learn to see color, whatever that means, you will probably make mistakes. You will probably be wrong at multiple points. You will probably be uncomfortable, and that is okay. It is also more than likely and more than possible that you will make a mistake or you will do something wrong, and a Black person will be done with you, and that is okay. You just still have to continue doing the work and accept the fact that that's what happened. But I feel very similar to I think something that you were just saying, Mark, like white people get so caught up in this, I don't want to be seen as a racist. And so that, I think that's where you get this sort of like weird cultural appropriation to show how woke you are, or, you know, trying to no longer even listening to what Black people are actually saying. You're constantly trying to prove how not racist you are. And in focusing on proving how not racist you are, you end up just being really racist. So just start from start from ground zero, that you've grown up in a racist world. You are more than likely racist. You have things to work on, and go from there.
Yeah, there's this idea that you know, Black and brown people need to be humanized. You know, you see all these projects of all ways that like we want to humanize this Black father with his child, you know, but it is not about humanizing us, right? The person that is coming from the place of ignorance or naivete, that's the person who might need some introspection, right? There was this idea of what we do to prioritize and protect white inferiority, you know, looking at different library systems, especially when it came to like around early 2000s, in the way that these racists were trying to enter the greeting rooms, right? And there was libraries that were saying, no, you can't access this space, right? But how you have, you know, places that who might be like ALA, who might say this is a place for everyone, right? But and in that respect, you know, what you've done, right? Now you spent however much money, $17,000, you know, 170 police and riot gear. You know, you shut down streets and you shut down libraries, like public libraries, right? In order to preserve, right, this idea, this racist, homophobic, transphobic, and sexist ideology. So it's again, you know, look at all the ways like the infrastructure has been made for you, right, and excludes the vast majority of us.
Thank you so much. I want to just stop there. We have a few questions from the chat that I want to get to, and also trying to be mindful of everybody's time and trying to end for 1 o'clock, since this conversation has been amazing. One of our questions, should librarians have mandated sensitivity training? And that was asked by Maria.
Should be built into the curriculum in graduate school. It's part of the discussion.
Okay. How do we as a profession acknowledge the tension between our commitments to diversity, cultural competency, and intellectual freedom? And how does the idea of intellectual freedom, how can it alienate BIPOC librarians?
I saw, so if anyone minds if I could just jump in on this very quickly, I saw someone in the chat who was a student speak about how whenever they attempt to bring up racism or something akin to these vectors of power in class, someone, usually a white student, will then say something about intellectual freedom. And I just wanted to say, first off, I see you. This has happened to me in classes before. I always wonder, like, and ask, intellectual freedom for who? Because if your answer to anyone speaking up about racism or injustice or violence is, but what about intellectual freedom? Then you are saying that the intellectual freedom of the person who's being harmed is less important than the vague idea of intellectual freedom or your particular intellectual freedom. And I believe if intellectual freedom is supposedly this like major tenet of our work as librarians and information professionals, then it should be maintaining intellectual freedom for everyone, correct? Anyway, that if there was anger in that, that was directed at the people who say that. It triggered me, it brought back memories. I'm sorry, I see you, I'm here with you.
We see you, Dre, yeah. If I could just add a point to that. So this thing about intellectual freedom obviously stems from the First Amendment. And this is the same thing we have in higher education about academic freedom. But what folks fail to say, and by the way, First Amendment rights are not applied equally to Black people. We don't have time to get into that. That's one issue, right? I can give you an example of a Black girl who was in Texas, recognized, you exercise her First Amendment right not to stand up for the pledge in support of Colin Kaepernick, and they suspended her, and it went all the way to the Attorney General of Texas, and I'm like, since 1943, West Virginia versus Barnett, you can't force people to do that. That came out of Jehovah's Witnesses saying it. So it's not applied equally. That's the first thing. And second, white folks fail to say when they're exercising their First Amendment rights, the First Amendment does not protect threats. And the way in which they use this intellectual freedom stuff is meant to threaten us. And indeed, it's been used that way before. But that's a history that people don't want to get into. They just want to say what they want to say, right? When we want to say something that makes them feel uncomfortable. So again, they want to control the dynamic. They want to control the conversation. So that's a larger part of the conversation, but I think that's a big piece of it.
With the extension of that, Mark, too, is that I remind my Black Studies students is that the Constitution of the United States was not written for people of color. It was written for white men.
That's right.
Rich white men. That's who the Constitution, when they talk about we the people, rich white men. Didn't talk about women, didn't talk about all others that they talk about in the Constitution. That's us. That document was not intended for, because we were not meant to be part of the body politic of the Constitution. Supreme Court said that, 1857. So we get into a discussion about rights and legislation, and that the intent is not what we're talking about in the 21st century. So yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
And off of that, can I just say one point is that, racism is not an opinion, right? And it's not a sickness. It's an act of violence. So I think that we need to understand that when we're talking about it. And I know that people like to do this freedom of speech thing, and it doesn't get at the point of what is happening here. We are dying because of this person's freedom of speech being protected, right? So, I'm sorry. That's again, this is something that I'm very. It's bothersome. Saying the very least, it's just irritating to know that it can still be utilized, right? And the court of law, right? And when we talk about like punitive justice, and we see all the people who are being held in these prisons, and yet we allow all these other hateful people to run around killing federal judges, killing Black men and women, trans women, and they get away with it. Enough is enough already. Enough is enough.
Yep.
All right, and I just want to offer one more question from the chat, and then we'll close. Marcy asked if we could explain the difference between cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation.
Appropriation versus appreciation. I'm gonna let Mark work on that one. I don't really see a drastic difference between the two. They're similar terms and they're similar applications, but I'll let as a doctoral academic, maybe you got a better way of separating those two.
Well, since Professor Jackson has given me the charge, let me make sure I understood. It was cultural appropriation versus cultural
appreciation.
Okay, so I think cultural appropriation happens when you have primarily kids or people outside the culture thinking it's neat to see how Black people rap and how hip hop is, and how they can throw around the N-word and how they dress. And so cultural appropriation is when they say, I'm gonna do that too. And in fact, to take it even a step further, we're gonna dress up like that at Halloween. And there are school districts who have things like, Thug Thursdays. We're gonna incorporate it in. It's real. So that's cultural appropriation, because there's a certain kind of racial component. And of course, kids who've done stuff like it. So, well, we were not thinking Black, but yet when they showed up, this was like the first step on getting to blackface. And they was like, well, that's not racist. And so y'all know last year we had a governor who got caught, years back dressing up in blackface, right? And so then we got some other white people that says, well, I did that too. So this is again what white people do when they're around white people and they don't think we're going to be there, and they're like, no, this is harmless. It's not about race. But then when you show up, it's like, oh, you caught me. So I think that's the cultural appropriation piece. Cultural, and it also comes with them trying to sing the rap and N-word and be like, you can't do that, right? Well, but someone said, no, you can't do that, right? So the appreciation piece, I think that for years there's been like an appreciation of Black culture, but it sort of, depending on who it is, this still can be kind of inappropriate for people. I think you can respect Black people having created jazz in this country and a lot of other music forms, which oftentimes folks just go so easily into monetizing what we do. I mean, how many folks you know who are white who got like hip hop, 1-2 dance, and they probably gonna have like some trap exercise. They just completely exploit it. But then they start off saying we appreciate that. So I think that appreciation is when you don't go overboard and do that and just say, I understand what you all are doing, and I get it and I appreciate it. And I know I cannot do that and I should not do that. You know, not that I did it, ooh, I'm sorry. I know I should not do that. And so for us as Black people, there's still space for forgiveness, but again, I think that's the distinction between the two.
I'm gonna just chime in and just say, are we in a place where we can separate the two?
Yeah.
And I don't think that we are, because every time that we've made allowances, right, we see what it looks like.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna say they're both the same, and appreciate me from afar, and you don't need to imitate me, and yeah.
Yeah.
You can appreciate me in my Venmo and Cash App. The appreciation I would love to see. And just to everyone's point, I think I think we really have to be careful about if there is even such a difference between appreciation and appropriation, especially because so often that comes, one, appreciation is brought up in defense after someone has said, I have been harmed by the fact you're appropriating. And then there's also a way in which this appreciation gets used as a way to say, look, I'm not racist. I'm doing the work. I'm woke. So yeah, to your point, Shar, I don't know if we're at the point as a culture yet where we can even be having the discussion about whether or not we're still trying to get people to believe appropriation is real.
Right.
So I don't think we're at the point where we can even begin to differentiate.
Nice. Yeah.
Beautiful. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to stop there. I want to just say thank you so much to all the panelists for being here, because this was only amazing because of all of you. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who attended. We really, really appreciate you. I want to just go ahead and reiterate what Ms. Mack said at the beginning. We're going to be adding the link to our chat where you can go ahead and donate directly to one of the 2 scholarships for NYBLC. Everyone's speaking about how to get Black people in librarianship. This is your moment. Show up for Black people who need help getting that degree. And just to let everybody know, we have a meeting tomorrow. It is at 11 a.m. Eastern time until 1 p.m. Zoom information is available on the caucus Facebook page. It's also available on the Instagram page. And last but not least, thank you for sticking around with us for these sessions. We've been enjoying it. We hope that you have all been enjoying it. So thank you for coming in and hanging out with us every week. Next Friday, we'll be here again, same time, 11:30 until 1 p.m. And we will be talking about microaggressions. So
let me make one comment. For those who are looking to learn more about the Black experience within the library profession and the issues and challenges of librarians, there are numerous works by Dr. E.J. Josie that need to be read to understand our story and our issues with libraries, serving our communities, access to within the community and the library community, and all the issues that have happened going back to the 1970s. So Dr. E.J. Josie's works are a must for anybody that wants to learn more about this.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
We're a little bit early.
Rebecca, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you
Great,
so much. Check out the chat room.
Marsha, call me. Peace and blessings, everybody.
Have a good one.
Blessing. Bless.